today we're going to talk about, we're getting off the topic for just 1 week, at least right now anyway, getting off the topic of women in Judaism to talk about a topic that Barbara brought up, which is the subject of secular holidays and the Jewish people. Are the Jews allowed to celebrate secular holidays? And today I'm going to focus on Thanksgiving. We were going to have class last week and it would have been more timely, but okay, that's the way it goes. So the question is, why would you think that we wouldn't be allowed to celebrate Thanksgiving? You could say, obviously, okay, Christmas I understand, it's a Christian holiday, but Thanksgiving is not necessarily a Christian holiday, it's not religious maybe in any way. So are there any issues that enter into this discussion? And as Barbara mentioned, or I don't remember which one of you mentioned it, but there are a variety of, depending on who you ask in the Orthodox community, of rabbinical community, you will get different answers. And we're going to see that there is, you know what, that's bad. Can I just take 2 seconds to plug this in? There are a variety of rabbinic answers and approaches that you'll get to the question. Yeah. Okay. I got it. Okay. So we start, first of all, I want to say that my class is based, today's class is based on material from Rabbi Michael Brody, who wrote an article about this called Is Thanksgiving Kosher? And it's also based on an outline, a class outline by Yeshiva University. So I have to thank them for that, for this information.
Brody, and?
Brody spelled Broyde, by the way. DE is Thanksgiving Kosher.
And that is a book?
It's an article. You can find it online. So there are 2 issues, basically, that enter into this discussion of is Thanksgiving kosher, basically. Is this holiday okay for Jews to celebrate? The first issue involves the question of copying the traditions and customs of the Gentiles, of non-Jews. And the second issue is going to be, as I'll talk about a little bit later, an issue of adding on to the Jewish calendar, adding a new holiday onto the Jewish calendar. So we'll get to that in a second. So the first issue is commemorating a non-Jewish holiday. It raises questions about the biblical law and rabbinic law, which says that Jews are not allowed to imitate non-Jewish customs. And this concept is known as chukas akum, meaning the laws of the Gentiles. Okay, so and it comes from Leviticus. You shall not follow their statutes. Okay, so now that's a very sort of big umbrella general statement. You shall not follow their statutes. What does that mean? Can I drink the coffee that they sell in the store?
They wear clothes.
Exactly, they wear clothes. Am I allowed to drink the coffee from the supermarket?
Are you allowed to wear clothes?
Am I allowed to? No, but not so funny though. But am I allowed to copy their styles of dress? Right. So what exactly does this mean? It's a little bit of a vague, broad, I should say, not vague, but broad sort of commandment. And the truth of the matter is that the parameters are not clearly defined. And so you have different commentators interpreting this in different ways. Okay, hence the difference in approach to Thanksgiving, as we'll see. So we definitely know that we can't copy religious practices, right? So, okay, Christmas we understand, but even, I can't put a tree up, but I can't even do anything that, for example, I can't, if I wanted to, let's say, fast during the month of Ramadan, right? I would not be allowed to do that. Even though my fasting would be for a holy purpose, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, I would not be allowed to choose that time because it would be copying the Muslims when they do it. So I can't do that. I have to stay away from that. So that would be like an example of a religious custom. It's a purely religious thing that they do. Now, the Gemara, I'm going to discuss a little bit of the Gemara's discussion of this mitzvah as a way of our understanding what's involved here.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, let's say it's a new custom.
Mm-hmm. Okay, as Thanksgiving was...
Well, let's say
ahead.
when you just mentioned fasting, what if all of a sudden another religion decides to fast when you want to fast?
Right.
I mean,
right.
Are we supposed to, have a zillion ways to find out who's doing what, when, and where?
Right. So the Rambam actually raises that as a question. Was it the Rambam? And I'm going to point that out a little bit later. I think it was the Rambam. It could be wrong. But he says, no, I'm sorry. It's I misquoted by a few centuries. It's, I think, Rabbi Feinstein who says, what does that mean that we can't, does that mean that if the Gentiles suddenly, decide that it's, that they're going to do a certain thing, does that mean we can't do it just because they're doing it? So it does raise, that issue is raised, and I'll come back to it if you don't mind when we get to that. So it's a good question. Huh? Right. Let's say the Goyim suddenly said, right. Okay. So, all right. So the Gemara gives a rule regarding chukas akum, again, meaning staying away from their statutes. And the decision is made in the Gemara that says if something is used medicinally, if a practice is done for the purpose of medicine, either preventative or treating, then it doesn't fall under the prohibition. Okay? So we're allowed to do something that is a custom of the non-Jews if it is beneficial to us medically. Okay. The Rambam goes further. He expands on that idea, and he says that this rule about medicinal practices really has broad applications. And he says any practice that is beneficial, but even more than that, logical, is okay for us to do as well. All right? Because, and that any practice that's not based on logic is prohibited. So anything that's logic-based. And now he goes a little bit further than that, because he questions his own position. He notes that there are numerous discussions in the Gemara about, for example, something that they did apparently, which is the using the nail of a prisoner or the tooth of a fox to protect oneself from harm or illness. Okay? Now, he says that these practices have no clear logic to them, right? So by the Rambam's own decision about this idea of logic, it shouldn't make sense to be able to do it. But he says that the Gemara that doesn't see any problem with these. So the Rambam answers this dilemma. He says, it's even if we don't understand the logic behind it, if the masses believe that it's helpful and beneficial, that it's an effective form of medicine, and I guess maybe sort of by extension, it's a case of mind over matter, a placebo effect, that it's beneficial, then we're allowed to do it, even if we don't understand the logic. Okay? All right. So according to the Tosafot, is a medieval Talmud commentary, 2 different types of customs are forbidden, absolutely forbidden. Number 1, those associated with idol worship, all right, or idolatrous practices. Okay, so for example, I'll give you a very a contemporary example. There is a lot of information out there and news these days about shaitels, wigs, that come from places in Asia like India, specifically India, but I think there's also maybe other countries that the rabbis are telling women do not buy wigs made with Indian hair or this kind of hair. And why is this? Because the women in those countries donate their hair. They cut off their hair and donate it to temples, religious temples. And then the temples take the money that they get from selling that hair for wigs and they use it in their temples. So this is an example of something that we have to stay far, far away from, anything connected to idol worship. Lisa, you and I did the book of, the Sefer HaMitzvos a long time, it was a while ago already, and we noticed how many mitzvos there are, how many commandments there are, keeping us far away from any hint of idol worship. Remember? It was like over and over again. And so, it's, if there's the taint of idol worship near any custom or anything, that we have to stay far away from it. So that's one category of forbidden practices, idol worship, anything connected to it. And the second is anything foolish, just outright foolish. Okay, even if they have sources not associated with idol worship, like kissing the Blarney Stone. It's not necessarily, I don't know, maybe it is religious, but it's foolish, so we have to stay away from that. We can't do things that are just outright foolish.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know that...
Let me just finish by saying, But there's a but to this. If there is a precedent in the Torah, if we see something that it is a custom today that we have a precedent for somewhere in the Torah, then it's okay. And we're going to see a little bit later that Rabbi Feinstein again comes to use one of those precedents to say, therefore Thanksgiving is okay. But go ahead, what was your question?
I see that there are a lot of ornaments that are like Jewish star ornaments and things for
Right.
people that have the Hanukkah bush or whatever they call it.
Right.
And I know that in Russia, like my daughter-in-law is Russian, and even though they weren't allowed to practice any religion, they always had a Hanukkah bush.
Mm-hmm.
And so when she came here, they continued to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I find that kind of creepy.
The Hanukkah bush?
So it's kind of in line with the first thing that you talked about, that it's imitating. Like when you were talking about that first thing, I thought, I guess Hanukkah bush is out.
Yeah.
You know, that it's
Yeah.
imitating
Yeah.
the Christmas tree,
Mhm.
and therefore it's
Right.
like assimilating.
Right. That would be
It's
that would be something clear to me that again aside from the discussion about whether or not Christianity is called idol worship, it's definitely a religious custom,
Right.
Because it's closely associated with Christmas.
It was
So-
their way of being able to be Jewish by having something.
Right. I understand.
And
Yeah.
then the other thing is, like, my son has a problem with wreaths.
With what?
Wreaths.
Uh-huh. Right. Wreath.
Yeah, even though they have nothing to do with, Christmas, other than it's the pine cones and the.
Right.
But because I've seen them where they have like the Jewish stars in the boxes and.
Yeah.
They can be made out of flowers. For instance.
Right.
Yeah.
But he thinks it's like if I put one up.
I agree with that.
See,
There's something about wreaths.
Well,
that
a wreath
seems
is-
very.
But I
It's
have
something
them-
put up for Christmas, right?
No,
so
but
it's,
I have them year round. I have
Uh-huh.
them decorative like a plate. But
oh,
it's,
that's okay. So that would be different, I would say.
Yeah,
It's,
so,
so it's
I
a
mean-
good question. It would be something
So
to
I
ask.
have them year round with different I have one for Valentine's Day, and he's always said you shouldn't be doing that, and I'm like, but it's not Christmas.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
although the majority of wreaths are put up at Christmas, but you see them in like decorative.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah,
You do. Right. So that's an interesting question about.
Is that a bad thing to do?
Let's leave all these questions for the end, because once we've gone through all of these steps in logic here, we can maybe discuss that at the end. Yeah. Okay. So two things. So idol worship and foolishness. Okay. Rabbeinu Nissim and Maharik. These are classical commentaries. They say that they disagree with these two sort of designations, and they rule that only customs that have a basis in idolatrous practices are prohibited. Apparently foolish but secular customs are okay, as long as there's some reasonable explanation and they're not immodest. Okay. They give an example of something that is logical, even if it doesn't have a precedent in the Torah verse, it's permissible. They give the example of the non-parent, non-Jewish custom of, burning a king's possessions after he dies. So they say, now this is a non-Jewish custom, but we can do it because, now why did they do it? They did it because they want to show honor to the king, that nobody else is allowed to use the king's possession after he's gone. So it was a way of honoring the king. And so this is an example of something that it's logical to do, even though we don't have a precedent for it. It's not a Jewish custom, it's a non-Jewish custom. But there is a logic to it, so it's permissible. So the Maharik says, he lived a little bit later, 1400s, he says, now, here's his two categories of what's not allowed, is a practice that has no perceived reason to it. Okay, so it wouldn't be like the burning of the clothes of the king. It's something that's just, like I said, kissing the Blarney Stone. In that situation, now he says though, that if there's no perceived reason to it, we have to be concerned that it's possible that it stems from idol worship. Okay, and again, the Torah is very clear that we must stay far away from anything connected to idol worship. And the second category of forbiddenness is that it might have been a practice that was instituted for the purpose of promoting pritzas, which means immodesty. So we have to stay far away from those two kinds of things, idolatry and immodesty. Modesty is, of course, as we've discussed many times, is seen as one of the qualities of the Jewish people. Okay. Alrighty, the Vilna Gaon, much later, right? He's the 18th century. He says that really logical is not enough for it to be okay. He says we have to be able to say that we would come up with it on our own if left to our own devices. Okay, so it's not just something that that it's okay to burn the king's clothing because it makes sense to do that, but it has to be something that we, the Jewish people, on our own would say, let's do that. That sounds like a good idea. All right. So even if a non-Jew came up with it, it's logical, we must consider it chukas akum unless we thought of doing it ourselves. But Reb Moshe Feinstein says, in answer to this prohibition, he says, this is really kind of very difficult to determine, right? How do you guess that the Jews would have come up with it ourselves? He says, really kind of difficult. So he says we tend to be lenient on this score. He was, by the way, speaking when he wrote this opinion. He was answering a question about whether or not it's appropriate for Jewish people to give gifts to a mourner as a way of comforting a mourner. We don't have that tradition. Yeah, things like that, right. We don't have the tradition of bringing gifts to a mourner, but it's very common in non-Jewish practice. People do, right. So he was asked the question, is it okay to do that?
I mean, everybody brings food to mourners' house.
Not the mourner's houses I've been to. I've never...
Cookies and...
It's common. It can be considered common practice, but that was the question he was answering. It's not a Jewish custom. It never was part of the Jewish way of comforting mourners. The way of comforting mourners for us is to visit them and speak to them. It was never a gift. So the question he got was, is it okay to do it? So he uses this idea. Is it allowed? Well, it's logical. You can say that it's logical going by the Gemara's discussion about reason and logic, but going by the Vilna Gaon's his thought about how it's not enough that it's logical. We have to be able to say we would have come up with it anyway. Moshe says it's very hard to determine that, and so he was lenient on this, and he said, I guess he answered yes in the affirmative. Yes.
I always thought that it was the Gentiles who brought the food and stuff. But in the Jewish tradition, the food's already laid out for people who come.
Oh, so really, no, see, there is a halachic issue here. The halachic issue is that a mourner is not supposed to prepare their own food, right? So really, you do have people bringing, or there's someone designated in the family who is making the food in the kitchen for the mourners, because they're not really supposed to do anything like that.
That's the way I was.
Yeah, right. But what you're saying is a little different. What you're saying is there's food that's brought in for the visitors who are coming to comfort the mourners.
That's a Jewish thing,
Right. Food, exactly.
But it's not, because I remember my mother saying, we have to make sure we have this, and this, because I don't want it to look like.
Right. Right.
But on the other side,
it's not an Orthodox custom at all. When you go to an Orthodox, I mean, depending, I don't know. I'm sure.
There's a story like that.
Yeah.
This woman, her husband's on his deathbed, and she's baking. You know the story?
No, it sounds funny already.
She's baking, and the aroma is going to him, and he asked his wife if he could have one of those cookies. She said, no, it's for your funeral.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, so no, but if you go to an Orthodox mourner's house, you will not see food put out for the guests, the visitors. Okay. So that's okay, so we are up to Rav Moshe. Okay. Normative halacha follows the ruling that says that, again, if there's any connection to idolatry, we don't do it. However, if there is a reason, if there's a reasonable and logical reason for doing something, it's not connected to religious practice, it's okay. And the Rama gives the example of a physician who wears a special coat, right? The doctor coat. So that's a non-Jewish practice, and he says this is permissible because it makes sense. It's the point of it is to identify him as a doctor. All right, different professionals, right. And so the same is true for any custom done out of honor or for any other reason is permissible. Okay, so if there's a logic to it, there's a reason to it, we do it. Okay. There are some authorities that favor being strict and say that the only time secular customs are allowed is if they have a Jewish origin. According to this approach, secular customs created by Gentiles are prohibited even when their origins are not religious. So, for example, Halloween, it's not really, I don't know if it's a religious origin or not, but, it isn't religious. Yeah, okay. Okay, so that's issue number one, following the customs of the non-Jews. Issue number two, as I mentioned, is there is a prohibition of adding a mitzvah to the Torah, right? So, for example, any rabbi cannot suddenly say, okay, there's a new mitzvah on the books, we're adding number 614, thank you, that says we must only write in black ink. I don't know. You can come up with crazier things, the Jewish people. Okay, so there is that prohibition. We can't create a new mitzvah. So how does this apply here? It would be the question is creating a new holiday on our calendar. That's the issue, right? So the idea is that if it's forbidden to create and celebrate a new Jewish holiday, which it is, right? We can't even make up a new holiday to our calendar, but then it's like a kal v'chomer. Even more so, would it be prohibited to adopt and celebrate a non-Jewish holiday? Okay, now you're going to ask me a question. Go ahead.
I just want to know, if we can't create a new one, are we allowed to get rid of an old one that makes no sense?
No. Not if it's not a mitzvah, no. In fact, it's very difficult to get rid of any, not only law or biblical commandment, certainly not, even rabbinical commandments, but we can't even get rid of a rabbinic, less than a law, a custom. Once a custom is on the books, it's very difficult to get rid of. I'll give you an example. A great example is the Ashkenazic custom of not eating on Pesach legumes and rice and beans and all those. The Sephardim have that custom that they're allowed to. We have the rabbinic custom law not to, right? And, you may make the argument that today, because there was an original reason for that law that was put in place, which is that they were afraid they would not be able to distinguish between wheat flour, let's say, and rice flour. Okay, that's the reason for that innovation. You can argue today that we know exactly where all the flours are coming from, or this, can keep them separate in the kitchen. It's very hard to get rid. I'll give you another. There's a lot of customs and laws on the books that seemingly either are not applicable today. There are a lot of those. It's very hard to budge on those things. We have a saying that a custom is like a law in the nation. It becomes, over the centuries, over the years of doing something one way, it becomes sort of like it has the power of law in that we can't budge it. Okay,
but without creating a new holiday.
Yeah.
Can it just be said that it's okay to celebrate it?
Okay.
Without saying it's our holiday and you have to, and it's a mitzvah?
The short answer is yes.
Uh-huh.
And you'll see that the modern day poskim, decisors, rabbinical decisors, do say exactly what you're saying, and that's a middle ground. It's a middle ground, a way of a middle ground between you can't do it and anything is allowed. So hold on, we're going to get there. Okay. Okay. So the Gemara talks about. I thought you were going to ask a different question, because we do have the added holidays of Hanukkah and Purim. Those are rabbinic holidays that are added onto our calendar, right? Right? Purim is not from the Torah, and Hanukkah is not from the Torah. They're both rabbinic. But the Gemara discusses these things, and they say the only time that the Nevi'im added on to the Torah was regarding the institution of reading the Megillah on Purim. That's really the only mitzvah. There are mitzvahs associated with Purim other than that, but the reading of the Megillah, right? Everyone is required to hear the Megillah on Purim. How could they do that? How can they add a mitzvah on, right? So they derived that it was okay to do this. This is, in other words, the exception to the historical rule that they never added. They derived this from a kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer is a hermeneutic principle that means from a light to a heavy, meaning that if one thing is the case, then obviously this other thing must also be the case. Okay, so the Kal V'chomer here is like this. They said after we were saved from slavery, the Egyptian slavery, and we crossed the Sea of Reeds, and we were saved, we sang a song, right? Moshe got up with Bnei Yisrael, and they sang the Shira, the song, thanking God for saving them. You think I can have a little water?
Oh,
sorry.
Sure.
Okay,
Who
thanks.
else wants water?
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. And so if we sang a song after going from slavery to freedom, how much more so, here's the Kal V'chomer, how much more so should we sing a song, or in this case read the Megillah, after going from, in that historical situation, death decree to life. In other words, it was decreed against us, we were going to be killed. Haman decided that the edict was to destroy the Jews. Thank you very much. And so therefore we are allowed to sing, in this case, read the Megillah. Okay? Based on this approach, we celebrate Hanukkah too, because again, it is another example of being saved from death. And also, in addition to this, it's only rabbinic in nature. The rabbis didn't say this is a Torah mitzvah, a mitzvah that is the 614th. Okay. And in addition to that, there's another idea that says that the prohibition of establishing a new holiday applies only if it takes the form of a Yom Tov. A Yom Tov holiday is a day that we have prohibitions against working, right? And we have certain mitzvahs associated with, like a meal, right? A Yom Tov meal, etc. And if this new holiday is absent these things, then it's not really establishing a new holiday. This will be significant when we discuss Thanksgiving. Okay, Reb Moshe says that the later poskim, the later decisors, are not really concerned with the issue of Baal Tosef in instituting holidays. Baal Tosef meaning adding on to the calendar. But, okay, at the very least, holidays for individuals are permissible, and even a whole city can decide to take on an individual holiday, so it's not really an issue. Now let's get to Thanksgiving. So that's the sort of background, the legal background to the discussion of Thanksgiving, right? Okay. When it comes to Thanksgiving, among modern rabbis, the modern rabbinic thought, there are three approaches that we're going to discuss. Approach number one is that Thanksgiving, any involvement in Thanksgiving is forbidden because it's a Gentile holiday. Okay, that's approach number one. So you do have rabbis that say absolutely not, and I'll go through those in a couple minutes. There is another opinion that is more middle of the road, that says Thanksgiving is not a Gentile holiday, but yet we're going to limit the celebration of it. They would apparently permit the eating of a turkey meal. Okay, and the third opinion or approach says that it's really not a different day from Independence Day, and they allow any celebration that's appropriate for a secular observance. Okay, and the differences in the approaches are really attributable to whether it's appropriate to distinguish between secular society, Gentile society, Christian society, and idol-worshipping society. There are all these sort of gradations of culture that we have to also sort of take into account. So the modern rabbinic opinions, the first approach, as I said, is it's not allowed. This this approach is represented by Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner. He says,
Spell that.
Hutner, Hutner.
He's alive today?
I think he...
You gonna call him?
Yeah. I'm not sure if he is or not. I think he is.
Yeah,
Not
on
positive.
speed dial.
Not sure. He says, I'm not positive actually. He says that it's obvious and apparent, whatever the merit of celebrating Thanksgiving for the first time in the 1600s, he says the establishment of an annual holiday that's based on the Christian calendar is at the very least closely associated with idol worship and thus prohibited. So he says because he's saying that it's on the Christian calendar. The Christian calendar is the Christian calendar. So therefore, they're adding a day that is a day that is in perpetuity, right? Perpetuity, which is really not. It's a Thursday. It's not like a specific day on the calendar. It's actually the last Thursday of November, right? But he says that it becomes a holiday through the creation of an annual observance and celebrating, a certain way with a meal. And he says because it's a Gentile holiday, it's wrong. All right. Okay. He says, in addition, the celebration becomes a holiday through like I said, celebrating as I said, the meal, and you have a parade, and you have certain decorations, and even sometimes costumes, like the pilgrim's costume. So he says he doesn't really know that much about the Thanksgiving observances, but he says he knows one thing, that new thing that comes from fashioning itself after non-Jews, we should stay away from it. Okay. Quote, he says, in truth, one must distance oneself from these types of customs, and even from those events that are similar to these types of customs. It's so obvious and it's wrong. That's the first approach. Rabbi Menashe Klein agrees that it's wrong, since he says it's obvious that Gentile customs that have no Jewish basis should be avoided because they might have had idolatrous beginnings, right? Again, and we have this tradition that we stay far away from anything that could even have a touch of idolatrous nature. That even though he understands, Rabbi Klein says, even though he understands the purpose of the original Thanksgiving, that the celebrants were giving thanks that they made it through that first winter alive, they thanking God, but he says it could be a remnant of a case of a person who makes a private holiday. This is an idol worshiping person. He says it reminds me of a case of a person who makes a holiday for himself because he on his birthday, or because he shaved his head for the first time, shaved his face for the first time. That was a custom of the idolaters. And he says, it sounds like, it feels like this is the same kind of thing. Okay, so Thanksgiving could be a case like this, he says. Okay, so there's possibly even a biblical violation of that. Rabbi David Cohen also says no, but really because he for a different reason. He says not because it has non-Jewish religious connotations, but because it's foolish. And remember, we're not allowed to do foolish customs, copy foolish customs. He says, why is it foolish? Because it doesn't make sense to feel obligated to eat a turkey on a random Thursday in November. Okay, quote, to my opinion, to eat turkey for the sake of a holiday is prohibited by the rule of Tosafot, since this is an irrational rule of theirs, and following it is improper. Nonetheless, he says, okay, so if you're going to say we have to have a Thanksgiving meal, that's not appropriate. However, he says, there is no prohibition for a family to get together on a day when people do not go to work and to eat together if it is their wish to eat turkey, not for the sake of thanks, but because they like turkey. That is not prohibited. But the spirit of the sages does not approve of such conduct, as they are functioning as if they follow the practice of the Gentiles. So he's saying, if you're doing it, that it's not, okay, now we have to celebrate Thanksgiving and it's time for our turkey meal, but you just want to get together and have turkey, even though it's the same custom that the non-Jews are doing, that would be okay. All right. So that's the first approach. It's really something we should stay away from. All right. There is a second approach, as I mentioned, and that's taken by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was the major decisor of the 20th century. He actually published 4 responsa on the issue. A responsa is basically an answer to a question, but it is a more detailed and lengthy answer that sort of puts down the law, in answer to the question. So he decided that Thanksgiving is not a religious holiday. It's clearly a secular holiday. And even when the Pilgrims instituted it, by the way, it wasn't instituted by the Pilgrims, it was instituted as a national holiday much later than that. George Washington was the first one to institute it as a public day of Thanksgiving, 1789. And it was a day of thanksgiving to God in general. He says, even though it's not a religious obligation, even when they first instituted it, it wasn't like, okay, we have to do this every year for God. It's not a Christian thing, right? Therefore, it's not a question of establishing a new holiday, the second issue that we discussed, right? But it's only a question of following the customs of the non-Jews. So it's not a question of a new holiday. It's not a holiday. It's an observance that the non-Jews do. So the question is, can we do it because they were copying the non-Jews? So he says, quote, on the issue of joining with those who think that Thanksgiving is like a holiday to eat a meal, since it is clear that according to their religious law books, this day is not mentioned as a religious holiday, and one is not obligated in a meal according to Gentile religious law, right? So even in Gentile law, there's no obligation to eat the turkey. Halacha sees no prohibition in celebrating with a meal or with the eating of turkey. One sees similar to this in Kiddushin that Yanai the king made a party after the conquest of Kohelet in the desert, and they ate vegetables as remembered. So now he's even bringing, remember what we said, that one of the ways that it would be okay, a custom would be okay, is if there's some source in the Torah. Well, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein found a source in the Torah. King Yanai made a party after a conquest.
Who was that?
King Yanai, one of the Jewish kings. A party after conquest, and it says in the
vegetables.
he ate but the point is he made a meal in Thanksgiving. That's the point. So any time there's a reference in the Torah to a non-Jewish custom, then it's okay. So therefore he says it's okay on these grounds. Okay. Now he does say, however, all right, he says you should not celebrate it as an ongoing obligation on a particular day, because he feels that might be adding to the prohibition of adding to the Jewish calendar, or creates the problem of adding commandments. He, quote, nonetheless, it is prohibited to establish this as an obligation and religious commandment, and remains a voluntary celebration now. In this manner, without the establishment of obligation or religious commandment, one can celebrate next year too with a meal. But I think, nonetheless, it's prohibited to establish a fixed day in the year for the celebration. And it's only, and he says, so he's saying basically, you should not fix it on your calendar. You can't, in other words, say, next year on Thanksgiving, let's do this. You know, it shouldn't become a rigorous obligation for us. And he even says that even when Yanai did it, it wasn't a year-to-year thing. It was only that first year, okay? Okay. Okay, so, and again, he would also, he would say that it shouldn't be done with celebratory rituals. In other words, you shouldn't have like a stash of, little pilgrim hats that you bring out every time you have a Thanksgiving meal. It shouldn't be done with all the rituals associated with actually celebrating Thanksgiving, maybe reciting a text or singing a song, right? If you do that from year to year, you're sort of establishing a holiday that is an obligation to you in your head, and that would not be correct. Okay. He does say, right, okay, so now he also says something interesting like this, which is what you brought up earlier. He says, quote, thus it is obvious in my opinion that even in a case where something would be considered a prohibited Gentile custom, if many people do it for reasons unrelated to their religion of law, but rather because it's pleasurable to them, there's no prohibition of imitating Gentile custom. So, too, it's obvious that if Gentiles were to make a religious law to eat a particular item that's good to eat, halacha would not say we can't eat it, right? If the Gentiles suddenly said, we're now going to, even, let's say for a religious reason, Christmas was now going to be the holiday that we all eat fried food, or I mean that they would be taking that from us anyway. But we wouldn't have to say or a particular food, particular chicken. Chicken is now Christmas food. We don't have the obligation to say, "Oh, we can't eat chicken anymore."
Thank God they picked the ham.
Right. So any item of pleasure in the world cannot be prohibited merely because they do it out of religious observance. So
I can have my wreath.
well, right. Okay. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin is another one who goes middle of the road here. He says that it's clear that halacha doesn't consider Thanksgiving to be a religious holiday, okay? And that even if you live in a society where there are some religious denominations that celebrate Thanksgiving religiously, let's say there are people, or city, or town, where the inhabitants, they make a whole religious thing out. They go to church on Thanksgiving. Let's go to church, and we want to add a religious element into the holiday. That would still be okay, because it's clear that it has its origin secular. Many secular people celebrate it, so it's not an official religious holiday. That even though some people may make it religious, but he says he was in the limit the holiday group, and he says, maybe skip it every few years, so that you're not showing that you're establishing it as a holiday on your calendar. Quote, however, if the reason for the celebration is primarily secular, it's permissible to celebrate, such as the coronation of the king, the 4th of July in America, or Thanksgiving. For this, it makes no difference that some Gentiles celebrate these holidays in churches. So if the source is secular, and many secular people celebrate it in a secular way, it's not an official religious holiday, even though some people, Gentiles, may celebrate it in a religious way, does not make it forbidden to us.
I've never known anybody that celebrates Thanksgiving
right.
in church.
No, I don't either. Okay.
Yeah, Jews don't go to church on Thanksgiving.
No, I don't. But he said he's saying even if they did, he's saying even if they would, this is how much he's saying it's okay to do. Mm-hmm. He's saying even if there would be a group of people or even one family that celebrates it a religious way, it's not. There's no bearing on the way most people celebrate it, and it has no bearing on how you can celebrate it.
There's only one place that celebrates it. Nowhere else in the world do they do it. Like,
I don't think so. I think they do say something like this.
In other countries, you mean?
Yeah, I think so. What about Canada?
Do
They
they?
have something.
I wear that.
Boxing Day, but that's over by Christmas.
That's English.
English, yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that. He does say, however, that so even though he says it's okay that you can celebrate it, you can do the turkey meal. He says that even it is, however, forbidden to celebrate a secular holiday with Gentiles who are celebrating that secular holiday in a religious way. So if there were a group of, let's say there was a family in town that celebrates Thanksgiving in a religious way, and that would mean, let's say, certain prayers around the meal, the table, right? You would not be allowed to join them for the meal, even if everything was kosher, everything else was being equal. You can't join that religious celebration. You can make your own at home in a non-religious way. Okay, so right, and the same would be for any other celebration that a Gentile would do, a wedding, a funeral, a birthday. If they add a religious element to that celebration, we can't join in with them.
What if you at a non-Jewish wedding, they provided kosher food for you, and they make a benediction before the meal?
I don't know if a benediction is considered. You'd have to ask a specific rabbi about that specific case. Now, there's the third way of going, which is the more lenient way, and that is represented by Rabbi Soloveitchik, who said that it's not a Gentile holiday. It's permissible to eat turkey. There was no Soloveitchik, Soloveitchik, Soloveitchik.
It sounds right.
Yeah, exactly. He says in his view it's completely okay. It's not imitating Gentile customs. It's a non-issue. It's not a religious issue. It's an okay custom to follow. And according to his students, on Thanksgiving he would move his shear up into the morning so that he'd be able to catch a flight home on Thanksgiving Day and eat with his family. But he never I don't think he ever came out and said he Dafka eats, officially eats a Thanksgiving meal, but according to the students, that's what he would do so that he would be able to get home to Massachusetts, where he's from. So that's the third sort of, so there are, as we see, there's a variety of approaches. There are the more stringent people who don't celebrate it for the reasons that we've given, that it has elements of a Gentile custom, religious custom, whatever, and you should just stay far away from it. And then you have people who do celebrate it because it's just like, as was noted, just like 4th of July, going to see the fireworks on the 4th of July.
So in other words, depending on if you want to go or not, you can cite one of three.
Yes.
Yes. The rabbi says I can't do this.
Well, as I've mentioned, I think I mentioned in the last class, when it comes to choosing certain, roads, halachic roads, it's always good to have a personal rabbi that you ask these questions of and not rely on, you could say, well, according to this opinion, so I'll pick and choose. This opinion's good for me now. Maybe a different, this way of looking at things is not good for me in that case. It's always good to have an individual rabbi who knows your situation and can answer for you. But yes, you would have, there is enough variety of rabbinic opinion to cover you on any particular way of looking at it.
So you touched a little bit on like family traditions, kind of towards the end here.
Yeah.
I mean, at least it triggered for me. Like a lot of families create their own traditions that could be anything from the tooth fairy to, when I was a kid, we all had a lot of cavities. So our dentist gave us this idea that became our family tradition for a while that on Sunday for 1 hour we'd have candy hour. And we could just binge on as much candy as we want.
Right.
And it kind of worked because we were so grossed out that the rest of the week we didn't want to eat candy.
What a great nice idea, wow.
We would go to Target, used to be called Airway. Like we'd go to Airway, we'd pick out our favorite candies. Like it was our family tradition.
Yeah, that's
now, it's not based on any religious thing. Yes, maybe there was some logic about it to our dentist that...
but it also doesn't really, to me, doesn't strike me that it falls under the category of a Gentile custom.
Right.
It sounds like a piece of advice your doctor gave you.
Right.
So,
The other point I wanted to bring out is I once heard a very practical answer for someone about why they don't celebrate Thanksgiving. And that is that observant Jews thank Hashem all day, every day. You did a bracha before your water. We do a bracha when we come out of the bathroom. Like, everything all day long, we're thanking Hashem.
Right.
So it's almost like negating that to say, like, okay, this day is the day of Thanksgiving.
Right. There are, yes, that's certainly, I mean, that's the funny answer my husband gives my kids when they say, why aren't we doing a turkey?
Right.
By the way, we don't not do a meal because of religious reason, so much as because I ain't in the mood to make a whole huge supper Thursday before Shabbos. I make a Thanksgiving meal for every Shabbos. So, so he'll give them that reason when they say, look, we have turkey. Sometimes they say, why aren't we having a meal? And I'll say, we thank Hashem every day. We don't have. So, I don't. Yeah. Huh?
I'd like to respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because although we thank Hashem every day, we don't necessarily thank Hashem for the blessing that we have, that we're able to live in this country where we are. It's a blessing and a curse,
Right.
because we're so free that we become very assimilated. That's the curse part, but it's a time not only to thank Hashem, but specifically to thank Hashem for giving us this blessing to live in this country. And so I think that negates